As an expert, someone who spent decades in the American intelligence establishment, what is your take on everything that's transpiring with Trump and Russia?
Well, his effort to hide the story, his treatment of Putin and Russia suggests that with all of that smoke, there's some fire. And I don't know if it's money laundering. I don't know if it's some vulnerabilities that he's been compromised in Russia, but his treatment of Putin makes no sense in terms of who he is. I read some of the Manafort indictment. His ties to Russians and his vulnerability to Russia and his compromised status, and then the fact that he danced into the Trump campaign and becomes the campaign manager, and he's willing to work for nothing at a time when he's financially vulnerable. And all of the efforts of people like Carter Page, and even on a different level, people such as Sessions and Kushner who've lied about foreign contacts, and then having 100 people in the White House who the FBI and the Justice Department can't finally clear for security documents, all points to a level of corruption like we've never seen before. And whether it's going to connect the dots in a way that Trump will be engaged, and whether or not the Republicans, like Watergate, when Republicans realized when he fired Cox, when you had the Saturday Night Massacre, that's when the Republicans realized they had to stop defending the president. They had to start defending the government of the United States. And I don't see the Republicans ready to do that by any means. And it's not just because you have a stooge like Devin Nunes, who's totally politicized the House Intelligence Committee, but the Republicans are hanging on to Trump for dear life. I mean, this is their golden opportunity, the House, the Senate, and the White House, to do things they've wanted to do. So I don't know what it would take for Republicans to realize that Trump is going to do a lot of damage to what exists of our democracy, because I think the democracy has really been compromised, and there's going to be a lot of damage. I was at an institution that was compromised by corruption. That was the 1980s, the CIA, and they've never restored the credibility and integrity of the institution. When you harm one of these institutions, you don't rebuild it that easily. And a lot of harm has been done to institutions in this country, including the Congress.
For the general public, a lot of this is very, very new. The deep state. So for Joe Q public, be it at the barbershop or on the bus, I've heard people talking about this quote-unquote deep state. So for conservatives of a certain generation, that sort of old school Republicans, this is a sign of a great conspiracy. Nunez and others are trying to defend American democracy against this FBI, CIA, NSA cabal. But then, as I said, I sort of smile when I hear quote-unquote Democrats/liberals and progressives talk about it. It almost seems like in another generation, they would be very, very upset about, again, this very concept, but they seem very comforted now. What is the deep state, and how would you explain it to folks? Because as I understand it, this is just continuity of interests, folks who are professionals, who are careerists across administrations who are system stabilizing force. So maybe I misunderstand what's really going on.
The idea of a deep state in the United States, I think, is totally ludicrous.
Because you hear that a lot in reference to Turkey.
We had started with Turkey during the time of Ataturk about 100 and some years ago. And you hear it in cases where you have strong military leadership or strong authoritarian leadership. We've witnessed it in Egypt. We've witnessed it in Pakistan. The idea in the United States that these very conservative institutions, I was inside the CIA, I was inside the Department of State, the Department of Defense, and at the highest levels, these are very conservative institutions. But I do find whenever you have a failure of any kind, and particularly an intelligence failure, that leads to conspiracy myth. You had Pearl Harbor, and it was a conspiracy myth that Roosevelt let it happen. We knew the Japanese were going to attack, and he let it happen so he could get the country into war. And after, the Kennedy assassination, that was clearly an intelligence failure in a sense, and that led to all sorts of conspiracy myths. 9/11 led to conspiracy myths that George W. Bush let this happen because he wanted to go to war in the Middle East, in this case against Iraq 2 years later. And I think the Trump election has brought such division in this country, such polarization, that now you have his defenders come up with the idea of a deep state that's aligned against him. These are conservative institutions. The FBI and the Justice Department now are led by Republicans appointed by Donald Trump. The CIA is led by a Republican appointed by Donald Trump. The military is an exceedingly conservative institution, particularly at the highest level. So the idea that somehow there's a conspiracy among these institutions and that they've coalesced around the idea of compromising Donald Trump, to me, just makes no sense whatsoever. But on the left, you're starting to hear this kind of conspiracy myth. What's shocking to me, and it's true, I would also say this for the Russian hacking, it's not what the Russians did that's so shocking. It's that so many Americans could believe such nonsense that was put out there on social media by the Russians. I look at the Russian hacking as just part of a disinformation campaign that the United States and the Soviet Union and now Russia have been waging against each other since the end of the Cold War. In fact, you can look at U.S. covert action against the Soviet Union began after the Bolshevik Revolution, and we actually introduced military force into Russia. Exactly. So this is something we've always been doing. Now, if they weaponized this information, if they really got into state computers and weaponized it in terms of results of the election, which is what Obama warned them against, and Putin seemed to pull back after that, that would be a different story. But the fact that they could put out these bizarre stories and have a certain amount of success is shocking. You have to wonder, what about the dumbing down of this country? You know, what has happened to this country in terms of citizens' understanding of the government, of the political process, of how politics really works? That's what's worrisome. The idea that 63 million people voted for Donald Trump is quite shocking on one level. So I think there's been a dumbing down that's made conspiracy myth attractive to people and has made propaganda, such as the propaganda that the Russians introduced into the social media and to the debate, also quite shocking.
The Russians ran a perception management campaign. White and black propaganda, gray propaganda.
Very traditional, but it used, in this case, it was a cyber weapon that took advantage of social media.